The hiss of the steam engine was a dying breath in the frigid air. It was a sound of finality, a metallic sigh that surrendered to the vast, oppressive silence of the Oregon wilderness. For Elara Vance, that sound was the closing of one door and, she prayed, the opening of another. She stood from the hard, velvet-worn seat, her movements careful and deliberate in the narrow aisle of the passenger car. Even here, in the dim, smoky light, she was conscious of her own scale, of the way she had to slightly duck her head to avoid the oil lamps hanging from the ceiling. Her gloved fingers, worn thin at the tips, clutched a small, worn valise in one hand and a letter in the other. The paper was softened with rereading, its creases as familiar as the lines on her own palm. It was a map to a new life, a promise penned in a confident, masculine hand. A man named William Prescott had written of opportunity in Silver Creek, a logging town carved from the dense, formidable forest. He wrote of needing a wife, a partner to build a life with. His words were practical, not poetic, which Elara had preferred. They spoke of shared labor, of a warm hearth against the cold, of companionship. He had seen her photograph, sent by a well-meaning but distant aunt who ran a matchmaking correspondence service from the comparative civility of Boston. A handsome woman of good stature, the aunt had described her. Elara had always found the word stature to be a kind euphemism. She was the last one to disembark. The conductor, a man with a beard full of frost, gave her a brief, curious glance as he set the stepping stool down. His eyes traveled up, and then up some more, and a flicker of surprise crossed his face before he masked it with professional indifference. It was a look she knew well. She had been collecting such looks her entire life. The cold hit her first. It was a physical blow, a dry, sharp cold that stole the breath from her lungs and bit at the exposed skin of her cheeks. Snow was everywhere. Not the pristine, gentle snow of postcards, but a grim, trampled blanket of gray and white, packed hard and sullied with soot from the train and sawdust from the nearby mill. It covered the rooftops of the small, unpainted buildings that huddled together as if for warmth, and it piled in high drifts against the dark, looming wall of pine trees that encircled the town like a fortress. The sky was the color of old dishwater, a low, bruised ceiling that promised more snow to come. The only light seemed to be a weak, yellow glow from the windows of a saloon and the general store across the muddy, rutted track that served as the main street. She stood alone on the platform, a tall, solitary figure in a dark wool coat that was practical but not quite fashionable. At 5 feet and 11 inches, she was taller than most men she had ever met. It was a fact of her existence that had shaped everything. It had made her quiet, observant, and perpetually aware of the space she occupied. Back home in Ohio, it had made her an oddity, a subject of whispers and poorly veiled jokes. It had made her feel like a piece of furniture that was too large for any room. William's letter, with its talk of a new, untamed land, had felt like a chance to finally find a space big enough to fit in. But the platform remained empty. She scanned the handful of faces loggers in heavy coats, their faces weathered and bearded. A few women hurrying along with baskets, heads bowed against the cold. No one looked her way with recognition. No one stepped forward with a welcoming smile. Her heart, which had been a nervous, fluttering bird in her chest, began to slow and grow heavy. The letter promised he would be here, waiting. I shall be on the platform when the afternoon train arrives. He had written, "You will know me by my gray coat and a copy of the Gazette under my arm." Minutes bled into one another. The train gave a final, mournful whistle and began to chuff its way backward, leaving her in a cloud of steam that momentarily obscured the town before dissipating to reveal her stark solitude once more. The initial sting of the cold was becoming a deep, seeping chill that worked its way through her coat, her dress, her very bones. The townspeople began to notice her. It started with furtive glances, then longer, more open stares. A group of men leaning against the general store porch stopped talking. One nudged the other, jerking his chin in her direction. A woman shaking a rug from a second-story window paused, her arms still, her gaze fixed on the tall, motionless woman at the station. Elara felt the familiar heat rise in her cheeks. She was a spectacle, a strange, oversized bird that had landed in a flock of sparrows. She forced herself to stand straight, to not give in to the lifelong urge to stoop, to make herself smaller. She focused on the distant whine of a saw from the mill, the smell of pine and wood smoke, anything to distract from the weight of all those eyes. The hope that had sustained her for the 1,000-mile journey was beginning to fray, leaving behind the cold, hard threads of fear. What if he wasn't coming? What if he had changed his mind? What would she do then? Alone in this frozen, unwelcoming place with less than $10 to her name, just as a knot of pure panic began to tighten in her stomach. A man detached himself from the shadows of the storefront and started across the street. He wore a neat gray coat, and tucked under his arm was a folded newspaper. It was him, William Prescott. A wave of relief washed over her, so potent it almost made her dizzy. He was real. He was here. She took a half-step forward, a smile starting to form on her lips. He was a man of average height, with a tidy brown beard and features that were pleasant enough, though his mouth was set in a thin, worried line. He walked with a quick, purposeful stride, but as he drew closer, his pace slowed. His eyes, a pale, watery blue, were fixed on her, and she saw the exact moment his expression shifted. It was the same look the conductor had given her, but amplified. His gaze started at her face, then dropped, taking in the full length of her, from the top of her bonnet to the hem of her dress, which ended a practical inch or two above the dirty snow. His confident stride faltered. He came to a stop a few feet away from her, his pleasant face now a mask of undisguised shock and disappointment. The smile died on Elara's lips. The cold returned, sharper than before. "Miss Vance?" he asked, his voice tight. Mr. Prescott," she replied, her own voice sounding thin in the vast silence. "I am pleased to finally make your acquaintance." She extended a gloved hand, a gesture of polite society that felt absurd in this raw, untamed setting. He ignored it. His eyes did another quick, comprehensive sweep of her frame. He swallowed, and his Adam's apple bobbed in his throat. "The photograph," he said, as if accusing the small, two-dimensional image of a grand deception. It did not. It failed to convey the scale of things. Elara's hand dropped to her side. The heat of shame was afire now, burning her from the inside out. "I am as I am, sir," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Yes, of course," he stammered, looking not at her face but somewhere around her shoulder. He seemed profoundly uncomfortable, flustered, as if she had committed a grave social error simply by existing in her own body. "It is just, I had a certain picture in my mind. From your aunt's letters, the photograph, I was expecting someone more delicate." Delicate. The word hung in the air between them, small and sharp. It was everything she was not, everything she could never be. She was strong, capable, and healthy. She could work a full day, carry her own weight and more, but she was not delicate. "I am a strong worker, Mr. Prescott," she said, clinging to the practical promises of his letters. "I can manage a household. I can cook and clean and mend. I am not afraid of hardship." He finally met her eyes, and what she saw there was not malice, but a kind of panicked resolve. He had made up his mind. "That is all well and good, Miss Vance, admirable qualities. But you see," he cleared his throat, a small, nervous sound. "This is a small cabin, a small town, life here. It requires a certain fitting in." She knew what was coming. She could feel the words forming before he spoke them. The final, brutal swing of the axe. "I am sorry for the misunderstanding. Truly, I am, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as if afraid of being overheard, though the entire town seemed to be holding its breath, watching their small, tense drama unfold. But this will not do. I require a petite woman, someone small, who can make a home feel like a home. He looked so earnest in his cruelty, so convinced of his own reasonable requirements. He was a man who had ordered a teacup and had been delivered a tankard. He didn't know what to do with it, and his only solution was to send it back. Ilara felt a strange and terrible calm settle over her. The frantic hope, the shame, the fear, it all receded, leaving behind a vast, empty numbness. She had traveled a third of the way across the continent on the strength of this man's promise. A promise he had just broken because she was too tall. It was the most profound, most absolute rejection of her life. And it was happening on a public stage of ice and sawdust. "I see," she said. The two words were all she could manage. They felt like stones in her throat. He seemed to take her quiet acceptance as a relief. His shoulders relaxed slightly. "I will, of course, reimburse you for your train fare," he offered, reaching into his coat. "It is the least I can do. I do hope you can find passage back on the morning train. I am truly sorry for the wasted journey." He pressed a few coins into her unresisting palm, his fingers brushing against hers for a brief, cold moment. He did not look at her face again. With a curt nod, he turned and walked away, his stride regaining its purpose now that the unpleasant business was concluded. He did not look back. Ilara stood frozen, the cold metal of the coins biting into her palm. She watched him walk away, the neat gray coat disappearing into the deepening twilight. The watching eyes of the townspeople slid away, their curiosity sated. The show was over. She was no longer a spectacle, just a piece of discarded luggage left on the platform. Alone, utterly and completely alone. The letter, still clutched in her other hand, felt like a fool's prophecy. Its promises of love and opportunity had turned to ash. She looked out at the hard, unforgiving town of Silver Creek, at the dark, menacing forest beyond, and a single, silent question echoed in the desolate emptiness of her heart. What now? She did not know how long she sat there. Time had lost its familiar rhythm, stretching and compressing in the silent, deepening cold. After William Prescott had left her, a kind of paralysis had taken hold. To remain on the platform, the scene of her humiliation, was unthinkable. To walk into the heart of the town, to subject herself to the curious and pitying stares of its inhabitants, was equally impossible. So she had walked, her legs moving with a stiff, mechanical motion, carrying her away from the tracks and the station, past the last of the rough-hewn buildings, to the very edge of Silver Creek where the town gave way to the wilderness. She found a place to sit on the wide, flat surface of a felled giant, a tree stump easily 5 feet across, its rings telling the story of a life far longer and more dignified than her own felt at that moment. The air was still, the only sound the distant, rhythmic whine of the sawmill and the soft, almost imperceptible sigh of the wind through the tops of the towering pines. The trees stood in dense, silent ranks, their snow-laden branches a dark and intricate lace against the fading gray sky. They were a wall, a boundary between the small, harsh world of men and the vast, indifferent expanse of nature. Ilara felt as though she were sitting on the edge of the world itself. The watery afternoon light had begun to fail, the weak, chilled gold of the sun bleeding away to a palette of bruised purple and cold steel. Shadows, long and sharp, stretched from the forest, creeping across the snow like dark fingers. The cold was no longer a stinging bite, but a heavy, numbing weight. It had found its way through the seams of her coat, past her layers of wool and cotton, and settled deep within her bones. She held the coins Prescott had given her in her gloved hand, their metallic reality a small, hard insult against her palm, reimbursement for her fare, as if this journey had been a simple transaction, a purchase that could be refunded. He had not paid for her hope, for the dreams she had foolishly allowed herself to build on the long, rattling journey west. He had not paid for the shame that now coated her skin like a layer of frost. What was she to do? The question circled in her mind, slow and ponderous as a vulture. The morning train. He had suggested she take the morning train back to where? To her aunt's prim parlor in Ohio. To the life of a spinster, a burden. The tall, unmarried Vance girl, the thought was a stone in her gut. She had saved for a year for her one-way ticket to Oregon. There was not enough for a return journey, not even with Prescott's condescending coins. She could, perhaps, find work in a larger city like Portland, but that was 100 miles away. A journey that required money she did not have and energy that had been bled out of her on a train platform. A profound sense of futility washed over her. She was a ship run aground, her hull breached, her cargo of hopes ruined. She rested her forehead on her knees, wrapping her arms around her legs, trying to conserve some small measure of warmth, trying to make herself smaller. The instinct, ingrained since childhood, was still there, to shrink, to fold into herself, to occupy less space in a world that seemed to have no room for her. A single hot tear escaped and froze almost instantly on her cheek. She would not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry. Crying was a luxury, and she was destitute. The crunch of snow broke the stillness. It was a slow, heavy, and deliberate sound. Not the hurried scuffle of a townsperson, but the steady tread of someone comfortable in this landscape, someone who knew how to walk on frozen ground without slipping. Elara's head snapped up, her body tensing. Her first thought was of a wild animal, a bear or a cougar emerging from the forest at dusk. Her heart hammered against her ribs. But the figure that emerged from the deep shadows between two colossal pines was a man. He was tall. That was the first thing she noticed, a fact her mind registered with a detached sense of irony. He was taller even than her, broad-shouldered and lean, with the kind of powerful frame that was built not in a gymnasium but by years of hard, physical labor. He moved with an unhurried grace, his long legs eating up the distance between the forest edge and her stump. He wore no formal overcoat, just a heavy, dark red wool shirt, thick trousers, and scuffed, sturdy boots. His face was in shadow, but she could see he was hatless, his dark hair ruffled by the breeze. He stopped about 10 feet away, not crowding her, giving her space. He held no weapon, and his hands were relaxed at his sides. He simply stood there for a moment, his gaze taking in the scene, the lone woman on a stump, the small valise at her feet, the encroaching darkness. He seemed to be assessing, not judging. "It's a cold perch for this time of day," he said. His voice was deep, a low baritone that seemed to resonate with the quiet of the forest itself. It was calm, a simple statement of fact. Elara said nothing. She watched him, wary. She had heard stories of the kinds of men who lived on the fringes of civilization. He took another slow step forward, and the last of the evening light caught his features. He was younger than she first thought, perhaps 30, with a strong, angular jaw and a straight nose. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but it was a handsome face, made compelling by the intelligence and stillness in his dark eyes. And it was his eyes that held her. They were looking directly at her face, with a calm, steady appraisal. There was no flicker of surprise, no quick, insulting assessment of her height. He looked at her as if she were just a person, sitting on a stump in the cold. "The wind will pick up once the sun is fully gone," he continued, his tone still even and conversational. "It gets a particular kind of cold here, bites right through you." "I am fine," she managed to say, the words catching in her dry throat. Her voice sounded brittle, fragile. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging her words but not necessarily believing them. "The train is gone for the day. There won't be another till morning." "I am aware," she said. a defensive edge creeping into her tone. Who was this man to state the obvious, to catalog the details of her predicament? He didn't seem to take offense. He simply watched her for another long moment, his expression unreadable. She felt a strange compulsion to look away from his direct gaze, but forced herself to meet it. She had been stared at all day. She would not be intimidated now. "My name is Gabriel Blackwood," he said finally, breaking the silence. "I run a logging crew up on the ridge." He gestured vaguely towards the dark mountains behind him. She offered nothing in return. Her name, her story, felt like a fresh wound she had no intention of exposing to a stranger. "I saw what happened at the station," he said quietly. And at this, her composure finally cracked. A hot wave of shame washed over her, so intense it was dizzying. She looked down at her hands, at the worn leather of her gloves, unable to bear the thought of him having witnessed her utter rejection. "Prescott's a man who measures things with a very small ruler," Gabriel Blackwood said, and the unexpectedness of the statement, the quiet contempt in his voice for the other man, made her look up again. There was no pity in his eyes, but something else, a kind of grim understanding. "It's no matter," she lied, her voice thick. "It was a misunderstanding." "Looked to me like he was the one who misunderstood," he countered gently. He took another step closer. "Look, miss, I don't mean to pry into your affairs, but it's getting dark, and it's going to snow again tonight. You can't stay out here." "I will find a room," she insisted, though she had no idea how or where. The town had seemed to shut its doors to her the moment she stepped off the train. "There's only one respectable boarding house in Silver Creek," he said. "Martha's place. The hotel next to the saloon is no place for a lady." He paused. "Martha's a good woman. She always has a fire going and the coffee's hot. She won't ask questions you don't want to answer." The simple image he painted, a warm fire, a hot drink, a place of quiet refuge, was so tempting it made her ache. It was everything she craved in that moment. But to accept help from this stranger felt like another form of defeat. As if sensing her hesitation, he said, "I'm heading that way myself. I can walk with you. No one will bother you." The unspoken offer hung in the air. He was offering his protection. His sheer size and quiet confidence were a palpable shield. Walking beside him, she would not be just the strange, tall woman who had been publicly scorned. She would be a woman accompanied by Gabriel Blackwood. It was a subtle but significant shift in the town's harsh calculus. Slowly, stiff from the cold, Elara stood up. She rose to her full height, her back straight, her chin lifted. For the first time as he stood before her, she was not looking down at a man. They were nearly eye to eye. The sensation was so novel, so startling, that for a moment it eclipsed everything else. He didn't flinch. He didn't take a half step back. He just waited, his dark eyes steady on hers. She gave a single sharp nod. He bent down in one fluid motion and picked up her valise before she could protest. The bag, which had felt so heavy in her hand, looked like a child's toy in his. "This way," he said, and turned toward the faint lights of the town. They walked in silence. The snow crunched under their boots, a rhythmic, companionable sound in the twilight. She was acutely aware of him beside her, of the space he took up, of the easy, long-legged stride that matched her own. A few people still on the street turned to look as they passed. She saw their curious glances, the way their eyes moved from her to the formidable man at her side, and then quickly looked away. No one jeered. No one whispered loud enough for her to hear. For the first time that day, she felt invisible, in the best possible way. She was just a woman, walking down a street with a man. They were nearing the center of the town, the warm yellow light of the boarding house visible just ahead, when he spoke again, his voice low and thoughtful. "Silver Creek is a town that likes its boxes neat and tidy," he said, not looking at her, but out at the collection of buildings huddled against the vast darkness. "People here, they get an idea in their head of how things ought to be. how people ought to look, and they don't much like anything that doesn't fit. Ilara's hands clenched inside her gloves. She knew this speech. It was the preamble to another rejection, a kinder one perhaps, but a rejection all the same. But then he continued, his next words changing everything. "But I've found," he said, turning his head to look at her, his expression serious in the dim light, "that the ones who don't fit the mold, they're the ones who often end up changing the whole town." He said it so simply, with such quiet conviction, that the words bypassed her defenses and went straight to the frozen core of her. It was not a compliment. It was not flattery. It was an observation, a philosophy, offered to her not as an object of pity, but as a person of potential. He saw her difference not as a flaw, but as a force. He didn't wait for a reply. He simply gestured with his chin towards the two-story building ahead, from which a column of welcoming smoke curled into the night sky. "This is it, Martha's." He led her up the 3 wooden steps to the porch and opened the door. A wave of warmth, smelling of wood smoke, baking bread, and hot coffee, washed over her, and it was so wonderful she almost sagged with relief. He stepped inside, placing her valise gently on the floor. "Martha!" he called out. A short, stout woman with gray hair pulled into a tight bun and a flour-dusted apron emerged from a back room. Her face, wrinkled and kind, broke into a wide smile when she saw him. "Gabriel, I was wondering when you'd be down off that mountain. Supper's almost on." Her sharp, bird-like eyes then fell on Ilara, taking in her height, her fine but worn coat, and the exhaustion etched on her face. A flicker of curiosity crossed her features, but it was quickly replaced by a look of simple, maternal concern. "This lady is in need of a room for the night," Gabriel said. "Maybe longer." "Of course," Martha said immediately, wiping her hands on her apron. "Got the corner room upstairs. It's small, but the stove draws well. Come in, dear. Come in out of that cold. You look half frozen." Ilara stepped fully into the warmth of the boarding house, her senses swimming. Gabriel Blackwood nodded to her, a gesture of finality. "Martha will see you're taken care of," he said. "Ma'am." And with that, he turned and was gone, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Ilara standing in the warm, fragrant entryway, the quiet echo of his words still resonating in the air. For the first time since the train had hissed to a stop in this cold, forbidding town, she felt a flicker, a tiny, fragile spark, not of hope, but of possibility. The first morning in Silver Creek, Ilara woke to a profound and unfamiliar quiet. In place of the clatter and rumble of the train, there was only the soft, muffled silence of a world blanketed in new snow. She lay for a moment under a thick patchwork quilt, watching the pale winter light filter through the frosted glass of the small window. The room was sparse, containing only a narrow bed, a washstand with a ceramic basin and pitcher, and a single wooden chair. But it was warmer than she had been in days. It was a haven. She had slept a deep, exhausted sleep, the kind that follows a great shock. The events of the previous day felt both dreamlike and painfully sharp. The cold, the stares, the brutal finality in William Prescott's voice, and then the unexpected, steadying presence of Gabriel Blackwood. He had brought her here, to Martha's, and in doing so, had given her a small, solid piece of ground on which to stand. A gentle knock came at the door, followed by the landlady's cheerful voice. "Miss Vance, are you awake in there? I've brought you some breakfast." Ilara quickly sat up, smoothing her hair. "Yes, come in." Martha bustled in, carrying a tray that steamed with the scent of coffee, fried bacon, and fresh biscuits. She was a woman whose every movement was efficient and full of purpose. She set the tray on the small chair and beamed at Ilara. "You looked like you needed a proper sleep and a proper meal to start the day. Eat up. It's no good facing the world on an empty stomach." As Ilara ate, her first real meal in what felt like a lifetime, Martha pottered around the room, tidying things that were already tidy. Her actions were brisk, but her eyes were kind, and she kept up a steady stream of chatter about the weather, the price of flour, and the latest gossip from the general store, all without asking a single question about Alara's circumstances. It was a master class in compassionate distraction, and Alara was profoundly grateful for it. "I imagine you'll be wanting to catch the morning train," Martha said, her back to Alara as she straightened the simple curtains. It was a statement, not a question, a gentle probing of her plans. Alara swallowed a mouthful of biscuit. The words almost caught in her throat. I will not be taking the train. Martha?" Martha turned, her expression unreadable. "Oh." "My funds are insufficient for a return journey," Alara admitted, the confession costing her a measure of pride. "I will need to find work." A silence settled in the room, filled only by the crackle of the stove downstairs. Alara braced herself for pity, or perhaps a polite suggestion that she seek charity from the church. Instead, Martha's sharp eyes narrowed thoughtfully. They roamed over Alara, not with a judgmental appraisal of William Prescott, but with a practical, calculating gaze. Her eyes rested for a moment on the cuff of Alara's dress, which lay folded over the back of the chair. "Is that your own handiwork?" Martha asked, stepping forward and picking up the sleeve. Her calloused thumb traced the line of neat, nearly invisible stitches where Alara had mended a small tear. "Yes," Alara said. "My mother taught me to sew." Martha nodded slowly, a glint in her eye. "And she taught you well. These are fine stitches, strong and even, better than I've seen in this town, I can tell you that." She let the sleeve drop and looked directly at Alara. "There's no work for a governess or a shop girl here, not really, but a woman who can sew like that. A woman who can sew like that never has to be without a trade." An idea, fragile and tentative, began to form in the quiet room. Over the next 2 days, that idea took root and began to grow, nurtured by Martha's boundless practicality. She cleared a space in the corner of the main parlor, a cozy nook beside the large front window that offered the best light in the house. She produced a treadle sewing machine from a storage room, a beautiful old Singer, its black iron body adorned with faded gold decals. It was her own, she explained, but her eyes weren't what they used to be and her fingers were too stiff with arthritis for the fine work. She showed Alara how to oil its mechanisms, and soon the machine's gentle, rhythmic whir filled the warm air of the parlor. Alara established her small territory. She unpacked her own modest sewing kit, a silver thimble worn smooth with use, sharp shears, neat rolls of thread, a felt strawberry bristling with needles and pins. Martha found her a sturdy table and a comfortable chair, and just like that, Alara Vance had a place in Silver Creek. It wasn't the life she had been promised, standing beside a husband in a new home. It was a small corner of a public room, but it was hers. She had made it herself. She spent the first few days quietly, diligently, working on her own small wardrobe. She let out the seams on a dress that had always been a little too tight across the shoulders, and she added a clever panel of darker fabric to the hem of a skirt to give it a more fashionable length. She worked with a quiet, focused intensity. The familiar actions, the snip of the scissors, the smooth glide of fabric under the needle, the satisfying firmness of a well-made seam were a balm to her bruised spirit. They were tasks she understood, problems she could solve. With each stitch, she felt a little more of her own strength returning. The other boarders, mostly loggers and mill workers who came and went, paid her little mind. They saw her as a quiet fixture, another part of Martha's well-run establishment. It was the women of the town who began to take notice. They would come to visit Martha, and their eyes would inevitably be drawn to the tall, silent woman by the window, her long, graceful fingers guiding fabric through the humming machine. Her first customer was a young woman named Sarah Gable, the wife of the blacksmith. She was a shy, bird-like woman who seemed perpetually overwhelmed by her 3 boisterous young sons She approached Ilara's table hesitantly, clutching a length of blue calico fabric. "Martha said, she said you take in sewing," Sarah began, her eyes darting around the room, anywhere but at Ilara's face. "I do," Ilara replied, her voice calm and even. She set aside her work and gave the young woman her full attention. "My husband," Sarah explained, her cheeks flushing. "He bought me this from the catalog for my birthday. He meant well, but I don't know the first thing about making a dress. And with the boys, I never have a moment's peace." She laid the fabric on the table like a desperate offering. Could you possibly make something of it?" Ilara ran her hand over the simple, honest cotton. "It's a lovely color," she said. "It will suit you." Her voice was so devoid of judgment, so full of quiet confidence, that Sarah finally relaxed and met her gaze. Over the next week, Ilara worked on Sarah's dress. The process became a small, unfolding ritual. Sarah would come for fittings, her sons left in Martha's care for a precious half-hour. In the quiet corner, Ilara would measure and pin, her touch professional and impersonal. She spoke little, asking only necessary questions about length and fit. But her quiet competence was more reassuring than a torrent of friendly chatter would have been. For Sarah, these fittings became a rare moment of stillness, a time when she was not a mother or a wife, but simply a woman being cared for, her form being draped in something new and beautiful. When the dress was finished, it was perfect, simple, practical, but cut with a skill that made it hang beautifully. It fit Sarah's slight frame as if it were made for her, which, of course, it was. When Sarah saw herself in the small mirror in Martha's hallway, she burst into tears of pure, unadulterated joy. Word of the blue calico dress spread through Silver Creek like a summer fire. Suddenly, Ilara was busy. The work, as Martha had predicted, came faster than she could have imagined. Women who had been making do with ill-fitting, homemade garments or worn-out dresses from catalogs now had another option. They came with fabrics to be made up, with favorite dresses that needed mending, with their husbands' shirts that needed new collars, with their children's trousers that were perpetually torn at the knee. They came, at first, with a certain wariness. She was still an outsider, the tall woman from the train, but her skill was undeniable, and her demeanor was disarming. She was a quiet professional. She did not engage in town gossip. She listened more than she spoke. She treated the rough, homespun fabric of a logger's wife with the same care as the precious silk a merchant had ordered for his daughter. She charged fair prices, and her work was always finished on time. Slowly, cautiously, the women of Silver Creek began to trust her. They started to see not her height, but her hands. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after she had first arrived, the bell above the boarding house door jingled, letting in a swirl of cold air. Ilara didn't look up from the delicate lace she was attaching to a cuff. She was used to the comings and goings of the house now. But a pair of large, snow-dusted boots stopped beside her table. She looked up, and her breath caught in her throat. It was Gabriel Blackwood. He filled the space beside her, bringing with him the cold, clean scent of pine and snow. He had been up on his ridge, she knew, running his crew. She hadn't seen him since that first evening. He stood for a moment, simply looking, not at her, but at her workspace. His dark eyes took in the neat stacks of fabric, the spools of thread, the precise, organized nature of her small domain. He saw the finished garments hanging carefully over a clothes horse near the stove, waiting to be collected. He looked at the half-finished cuff in her hands, at the intricate, painstaking work she was doing. "Martha told me you were busy," he said, his deep voice a familiar, calming sound in the quiet room. "I have been fortunate," Ilara replied, her heart beating a little faster than usual. She put down her sewing, folding her hands in her lap. He finally looked at her, and a small, slow smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was a smile of genuine appreciation. "It's more than fortune, Miss Vance." he said. "It's skill." She felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the stove. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood." "Gabriel," he corrected her gently. He shifted his weight, and she noticed he was holding a large, heavy canvas sack. "I didn't just come by to admire your work," he said, a hint of amusement in his tone. He lifted the sack and placed it on the floor beside her table. It landed with a heavy thud. "I have a proposition for you." He knelt and untied the sack, tipping its contents out onto the floor. It was a mountain of men's work clothes, heavy wool shirts with torn elbows, canvas trousers with ripped seams and missing buttons, thick jackets stained with pine sap and dirt. They were the casualties of hard labor in a harsh environment. "My men," he explained, looking up at her from his crouch. "They're good loggers, but they're hell on their clothes, and none of them can thread a needle to save his life. They patch things with wire or just let them rip. It's not good for morale, and it's dangerous in the cold when a jacket won't close properly." He stood up again, his gaze steady and serious. "This is rough work, mending canvas and heavy wool, not like that." He nodded toward the delicate lace cuff. "It takes a strong hand, and more patience than most people have. I'll pay you well for it. Whatever you think is fair. Can you do it?" Ilara looked from his earnest face down to the heap of ruined clothing. It was a daunting task. It was hard, unglamorous work, and it was, in its own way, the highest compliment she had ever received. William Prescott had wanted someone petite, someone delicate to fit into his small, neat world. Gabriel Blackwood stood before her, offering her the toughest, most demanding work he had. Not in spite of her strength, but because of it. He was not asking her to be smaller. He was asking her to be as strong as she was. For the first time since she had arrived in this town, she felt seen, truly seen. She looked directly into his dark, steady eyes. A small smile, her own this time, touched her lips. "Yes, Gabriel," she said, her voice clear and firm. "I can do it. I have a very strong hand." The annual Church Harvest Festival was the undisputed centerpiece of Silver Creek's social calendar. It was a time when the hard, isolating work of logging and homesteading was set aside for a single evening of community, music, and food. The church hall, usually a place of solemn prayer, was transformed. Lanterns cast a warm, honeyed glow over the rough-hewn wooden walls, and long trestle tables groaned under the weight of the townswomen's offerings: roasted chickens, glazed hams, bowls of steaming vegetables, and a formidable array of pies and cakes. The air was thick with the scent of pine from the decorative boughs, roasting meat, cinnamon, and beeswax candles. In one corner, a trio of local men, a fiddler, a guitarist, and a man with a set of spoons were tuning their instruments, their sporadic notes a promise of the dancing to come. For Ilara, the festival had been a source of quiet dread for a week. To voluntarily enter the heart of the community, to stand in a brightly lit room and be seen by everyone, felt like a deliberate act of self-exposure. Her life for the past month had been a safe, circumscribed routine within the warm confines of Martha's boarding house. Her sewing corner was her domain, a place where she was in control, where her value was measured by the quality of her stitches. Out there, in the church hall, she would once again be measured by a different, crueler standard. "Nonsense," Martha had declared, brooking no argument. "You are a part of this town now. Ilara, you work harder than most, and you contribute more than many. You will go, and you will hold your head high." And so, Ilara had decided that if she were to be an exhibition, she would at least be the curator of it. She would not wear one of her sensible, mended brown or gray dresses. For the past week, in the quiet hours after she had finished her customer's work, she had been creating something for herself. It was a dress made from a bolt of deep forest green wool she had bought with her own earnings. The color was rich and alive, the color of the pines in summer. The design was her own, born of a lifetime of trying to accommodate a frame that patterns were not made for. It had a simple, high neckline that emphasized the long, graceful column of her neck, and long, close-fitting sleeves. The bodice was tailored with an expert's hand, its darts and seams creating a clean, flattering line. The skirt was full but not fussy, designed to move with her, falling from her waist to the floor in a single, unbroken sweep. It was not a fashionable dress by Boston standards, but it was a statement. It was a garment of unapologetic elegance, designed not to hide her height, but to celebrate it. When she came down the stairs, Martha, who was waiting in the entryway, simply stopped and stared. "Oh, my child," the older woman breathed, her eyes shining. "You are magnificent," walking to the church hall on Martha's arm. Alara felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. The dress moved beautifully, the wool heavy and comforting against her skin. It was her armor. Each stitch was a tiny act of defiance against the memory of William Prescott and his desire for a petite woman. The moment they stepped through the open doorway, a subtle change rippled through the crowded room. Conversations did not stop entirely, but they faltered. Heads turned. The ambient hum of chatter dropped by a perceptible degree. Alara felt the familiar wave of dozens of eyes settling on her. But this time, it was different. She was not the disheveled, humiliated stranger from the train platform. She was Alara Vance, the seamstress, a woman they now knew by her work. And she was wearing a dress that commanded respect. The women's eyes held a new light, not just curiosity, but a flicker of admiration, even envy. The men simply stared. She kept her gaze fixed ahead, a small, serene smile on her lips, and allowed Martha to guide her towards the food tables. They filled their plates, Martha keeping up a steady stream of commentary on whose apple pie was likely to be the best this year. Alara was acutely aware of the whispers that followed in her wake, but she refused to let them break her composure. She had earned her place at this festival, paid for it with needle and thread. They found a space at the end of a long bench, and Alara was just raising a forkful of sweet potato to her lips when she saw him. William Prescott was standing with a small group of merchants near the doorway. He was holding a cup of cider, a look of smug satisfaction on his face as he held court. His gaze swept the room and then, inevitably, it found her. His smile tightened. He watched her for a long moment, a muscle twitching in his jaw. She could see the disbelief and irritation warring in his expression. This was not the defeated woman he had dismissed on the platform. This was a woman who was, against all his expectations, thriving. He said something to the man beside him, a portly shopkeeper named Henderson. Prescott gestured subtly with his cup in her direction, and both men smirked. Prescott's voice, though not loud, was pitched to carry in the small hall. "Seems the air is thin up that end of the room," he said, and Henderson let out a wheezing laugh. "One ought to be careful not to get a nosebleed from the altitude." The crude joke, so juvenile and petty, landed exactly as he'd intended. A few people nearby snickered. Alara felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. Her fork froze midway to her mouth. For a single, terrible moment, she was back on the train platform, cold and alone, the object of public scorn. The beautiful dress, her carefully constructed composure, it all felt like a fragile sham. Martha bristled beside her. "Pay that fool no mind," she muttered, her voice a low growl. But the damage was done. The small bubble of peace Alara had found was burst. She put her fork down, her appetite gone. She felt the eyes of the room on her again, waiting to see how she would react to the public insult. And then, the door opened again. Gabriel Blackwood stepped into the hall. He had to duck his head slightly to clear the frame. He wore a clean, dark blue shirt and dark trousers. Simple clothes that nonetheless stood out. Like her, he did not blend in. The room seemed to subtly realign itself around his presence. He was not a town merchant. He was a man of the forest, and he brought a different kind of authority into the room. His dark eyes scanned the crowd, a calm, assessing look on his face. He nodded to a few of his loggers, exchanged a brief word with the blacksmith, and then his gaze found her. It was as if a line had been drawn through the noisy, crowded room, connecting the two of them. His expression did not change, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes: recognition, acknowledgement. He ignored William Prescott and his snickering companions completely. He began to walk towards her, his stride long and unhurried, a path clearing before him as if by magic. He stopped in front of her, the top of her head when she was seated coming only to his chest. He looked down at her, and then at the plate of food she had abandoned. "Good evening, Elara," he said, his deep voice cutting through the nearby chatter. He had never used her first name before. It sounded right. "Gabriel," she replied, her own voice barely a whisper. He looked over at the musicians, who had just struck up the first lively reel of the evening. Several couples were already making their way to the cleared space in the center of the hall. He turned back to her. "I am not much of a dancer," he said, a statement that was belied by the natural grace of his movements. "But it would be an honor if you would join me." It was not a question so much as a quiet command. It was a public and undeniable gesture. He was choosing her, in front of everyone, in front of William Prescott. She saw Prescott's face from the corner of her eye. His smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. Slowly, Elara stood up. She rose to her full, magnificent height, the green wool of her skirt swirling around her ankles. She placed her hand in the large, calloused one he offered her. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. He led her to the center of the floor. The fiddler, seeing them, grinned and launched into a slower, more graceful waltz. Gabriel placed a hand gently but firmly on her waist and drew her into position. And then they danced. All of Elara's lifelong awkwardness, her fear of tripping over partners, of stooping and hunching, simply melted away. For the first time in her life, she was dancing with a man who was her physical equal. Her hand rested comfortably on his broad shoulder without her having to reach up. Her eyes met his directly, without her having to look down. He was a natural, confident leader, guiding her through the steps with a subtle pressure of his hand, a slight shift of his weight. They moved together in perfect, effortless harmony. The world of the church hall, the whispers, the stares, the petty cruelties receded until there was only the music, the warm glow of the lanterns, and the solid, reassuring presence of the man holding her. It felt less like dancing and more like a homecoming. It felt like they had been doing this forever. When the music finally sighed to a stop, they stood for a moment in the center of the floor, the other dancers swirling around them. The applause was genuine. Gabriel's hand was still on her waist, his thumb resting gently on her side. A small smile played on his lips. "Not much of a dancer, you said," she murmured, her cheeks flushed with the exertion and the exhilaration. "I find it depends entirely on the partner," he replied, his dark eyes holding hers. They walked off the floor, and the spell was broken by the grating voice of William Prescott. He had positioned himself near the edge of the dance floor, his arms crossed, a sneer on his face. "Quite a spectacle. Blackwood," Prescott said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You two should join a traveling circus. The giant and the giantess." The air grew tense. Gabriel's hand, which was still holding hers, tightened. She saw his jaw clench, a dangerous stillness coming over him. He took a half-step forward, and for a moment, Elara thought he was going to strike the smaller man. But before he could speak, Elara stepped forward slightly, placing herself between them. She looked down at William Prescott, not with anger, but with a kind of clear, cold pity. All the fear and shame he had ever made her feel had been burned away in the warmth of the dance. She was no longer his victim. She met his watery, resentful eyes and spoke, her voice not loud, but clear and steady enough for everyone nearby to hear. "You are right about one thing, Mr. Prescott," she said calmly. "We are not made to the same scale." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But I would much rather have a frame that stands tall in the world than a heart that is so very small." A collective gasp went through the small crowd. Prescott's face went from pale to a blotchy, furious red. He was speechless, utterly defeated by the simple, elegant truth of her words. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, sputtering like a landed fish. Elara didn't wait for his reply. She turned her back on him. Gabriel was looking at her, his expression one of profound, undisguised admiration. A slow, proud smile spread across his face. Without a word, he took her hand again, his grip firm and unwavering, and led her away from the sputtering merchant and back towards the quiet corner where Martha was beaming like the rising sun. He did not let go of her hand for the rest of the evening. The weeks following the harvest festival settled into a rhythm of quiet productivity. The winter deepened, draping Silver Creek in a thick, seemingly permanent mantle of white. The world outside Martha's boarding house was a landscape of stark contrasts, the brilliant, blinding white of the snow against the deep, bruised purple of the forest shadows. Inside, however, was a world of warmth, order, and the steady, comforting whir of Elara's sewing machine. She was no longer an outsider. She was the seamstress. Women greeted her on the street with a nod and a smile. Men who had once stared at her height now touched the brims of their hats in respectful acknowledgement. She had a small but steady stream of income, enough to pay Martha for her room and board, purchase her own supplies, and even put a little aside. She had woven herself, stitch by stitch, into the rough fabric of the town. Her most consistent work came from Gabriel Blackwood's logging camp. Once a week, one of his men would ride down from the ridge, a sack of torn and battered clothing slung over his saddle, and once a week he would collect the previous week's mending, each garment expertly patched, reinforced, and folded, with every last button sewn firmly in place. Elara took a quiet pride in this work. The heavy, sap-stained canvas and thick, scratchy wool were a testament to the hard, dangerous lives these men led. Mending their clothes felt like a small act of care, a way of protecting them from the cold, of sending a bit of order back up the mountain into their chaotic world. She rarely saw Gabriel himself. He was busy, driving his crew to cut as much timber as possible before the truly deep snows made the work impossible. But his presence was a constant, unspoken thread in her life. Sometimes a brief, scribbled note would be tucked into the sack of clothes. "The men are grateful. E.V." or "This is fine work." Once, he sent down a perfectly carved wooden bluebird, its form so simple and elegant it took her breath away. She kept it on her sewing table, a small, silent companion. Their dance at the festival remained a vivid, cherished memory, a secret garden she could retreat to in her mind. The feeling of his hand on her waist, the effortless way they had moved together, the undisguised admiration in his eyes when she had stood up to William Prescott. It was a new and dizzying currency of self-worth. She found herself thinking of him at odd moments, wondering if he was safe on the mountain, if he was warm, if he ever thought of their dance. One Tuesday afternoon, the sky, which had been a clear, cold blue, began to curdle. A gray film spread from the west, and the wind began to pick up, moaning around the corners of the boarding house. Martha came into the parlor, her arms full of firewood. "Blizzard's coming," she announced, her tone matter-of-fact. "A real nasty one. By the look of it, sky has that bruised color." By late afternoon, the first flakes began to fall, small and hard, driven almost horizontally by the rising wind. Within an hour, the world outside the window had dissolved into a churning, milky chaos. The wind was no longer a moan, but a high, keening shriek that rattled the window panes in their frames. The air grew dark, as if night had decided to fall hours early. Elara lit a lamp. its golden glow pushing back against the encroaching gloom. The storm was a wild, terrifying thing. But inside, the parlor was an island of peace. The stove radiated a bone-deep warmth, and the rhythmic hum of her treadle was a comforting counterpoint to the fury outside. She was working on one of Gabriel's shirts, a heavy red wool one, mending a tear near the shoulder. She held the familiar fabric in her hands, the rough texture a tangible connection to the man who wore it. She imagined him up on the mountain, hoped he and his men had found shelter from this monster of a storm. The front door burst open with a crash, flung inward by a gust of wind that sent a swirl of snow and freezing air rushing into the room. It extinguished 2 lamps and sent papers flying. A figure stumbled in, half falling, and slammed the door shut against the storm's assault. It was Jed, a young logger from Gabriel's crew, barely 18. He was covered from head to toe in snow, his face pale and stricken under a dusting of ice. His chest was heaving, and his eyes were wide with panic. "Martha," he gasped, his voice raw. "We need the doctor." Martha rushed forward, her face a mask of concern.
"Jedediah, what is it? What's happened?"
"It's the boss," Jed choked out, brushing frantically at the snow caked on his coat. "It's Mr. Blackwood." Alara's hands went still. The red shirt lay in her lap, but she no longer felt its texture, a cold dread, far more chilling than the wind that had just blasted through the room, seized her heart. "We were trying to clear a jam on the skid road," Jed explained, his words tumbling over one another in a frantic rush. "A widowmaker, a big one. It snapped loose in the wind." He swallowed hard, his young face contorted with horror. "It was coming right for Billy, the boss. He shoved him clear. He shoved him out of the way. But it caught him. The whole damn tree came down right on him." The sewing needle slipped from Alara's numb fingers and fell silently onto the rug. The room seemed to tilt, the roaring of the wind outside fading to a distant hum, replaced by the frantic pounding of her own blood in her ears. "Is he—" Martha began, her voice trembling. "He's alive," Jed said quickly. "We got him out, made a sledge. Took 4 of us near 2 hours to get him down the mountain in this. He's at Doc Adams' clinic now. The doc sent me to fetch you. Said he needs help." Martha was already moving, grabbing her heavy cloak and a medical bag she kept for emergencies. But Alara was faster. She didn't think. She didn't plan. An instinct, fierce and undeniable, took over her body. The carefully constructed world of her sewing corner, her reputation, her quiet, orderly life, it all vanished. There was only the image of Gabriel, broken under a tree, and the terrifying, all-consuming need to get to him. She shot to her feet, knocking over her chair. The red shirt slid to the floor.
"Alara, child, wait,"
Martha cried, seeing the wild look in her eyes.
"You can't go out in that. It's a whiteout. Wait for me."
But Alara didn't hear her. She was already at the door, pulling on her coat, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. She didn't bother with a hat or a proper scarf. She just yanked the door open and plunged out into the maelstrom. The wind hit her like a physical blow. It was a solid wall of force and ice that stole her breath and tried to push her back. The air was not air, but a thick, swirling vortex of snow, so dense she could not see more than 3 feet in front of her. The cold was shocking, a pain that was instant and absolute. It burned her lungs, stung her eyes, and clawed at the exposed skin of her face and neck. The doctor's clinic was only 4 buildings down the street, a journey that normally took less than a minute. In the blizzard, it was a terrifying, disorienting trek across a frozen, alien landscape. The drifts were already knee-deep, and she stumbled, catching herself on a hitching post she couldn't see but knew was there. The wind shrieked in her ears, a deafening, inhuman sound that seemed to mock her efforts. She lost her bearings almost immediately. The familiar shapes of the buildings were gone, erased by the swirling white. Panic, cold and sharp, rose in her throat. She fought it down, forcing herself to focus. She could feel the rough boards of the general store's porch beneath her feet. She knew the clinic was next. She kept one hand on the wall of the building, using it as a guide, and pushed herself forward, leaning into the wind, her head down, one agonizing step at a time. The snow drove into her eyes, half blinding her, and she could feel her hair and eyelashes freezing solid. Her mind was a maelstrom of fear, but one word was a steady anchor in the chaos. Gabriel, Gabriel, Gabriel. It was a prayer, a plea, a reason to keep moving when every instinct screamed at her to find shelter. She almost missed the door, her frozen fingers brushing against the cold brass of the knob. She fumbled with it, her hands clumsy and numb, and then she was falling inside, into a world of lamplight, warmth, and the sharp, clean smell of carbolic acid. The clinic was a single, crowded room. Dr. Adams, a small, balding man with wire-rimmed spectacles, was working frantically over a figure laid out on the examination table in the center of the room. Two of Gabriel's loggers stood by, their faces pale and helpless. Ilara's eyes went straight to the table. It was him. He was deathly pale beneath the grime and a smattering of blood. His thick, dark hair was matted with snow and something darker. One of his legs was twisted at an unnatural angle, bound in a crude splint made of saplings and torn shirts. His heavy wool shirt not the one she had been mending. She noted with a strange, detached part of her brain was cut away, revealing a chest and abdomen that were a mass of dark, angry bruises. A bloody gash ran from his temple into his hairline. He was a ruin. The powerful, vital man she had danced with was broken. A wave of nausea and grief washed over her, so potent it made her sway on her feet. Dr. Adams looked up, his face grim and exhausted. "Ilara."
"Thank God. Martha sent you."
He didn't wait for an answer.
"His leg is shattered, a bad compound fracture, several broken ribs, I think, and a nasty concussion. I've done what I can to set the bone, but he's lost blood. And the shock," he trailed off, shaking his head.
Ilara moved forward then, her frozen limbs stiff and awkward. She walked to the side of the table, her gaze fixed on Gabriel's still face. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and ragged. She wanted to touch him, to smooth the damp hair from his forehead, but she didn't dare. She felt like an intruder, a usurper of a position she had no right to claim. And then his eyelids flickered, slowly, as if it took all the strength he had left in the world. He opened his eyes. They were unfocused at first, clouded with pain and confusion. They roamed the room, over the doctor, over his men, and then they found her. They focused. The fog cleared, and a flicker of recognition, of something deeper, ignited in their dark depths. His lips, cracked and pale, parted.
"Ilara."
His voice was a mere rasp, a ghost of its usual deep resonance. But it was her name. In that room full of people, in the depths of his pain, it was her name that he had called. The sound broke through her shock and grief. It anchored her. It gave her purpose. The tears that had been frozen in her eyes began to fall, hot and silent, down her icy cheeks.
"I am here, Gabriel,"
she whispered. And this time she did reach out, her trembling, half-frozen fingers gently touching his arm.
"I am here."
From that moment on, she did not leave his side. Martha arrived minutes later, a gust of practicality and competence, and took charge of organizing the small clinic. But Ilara remained at the head of the table, a silent, watchful sentinel. The long night bled into a gray, stormy day, and then into another night. The blizzard raged for 2 full days, cutting Silver Creek off from the rest of the world. Inside the clinic, time was measured not by the clock, but by the rhythm of Gabriel's breathing. Ilara became an extension of the doctor's will, her hands steady and sure. She learned to clean his wounds, to change his bandages, to spoon small sips of water between his lips. She bathed his face with cool water, wiping away the grime and the sweat of his fever. She sat through his bouts of delirium, listening to him mutter about timber counts and broken harnesses, her low, calm voice a steady anchor to soothe him. When he was sleeping, a fitful, pain-filled sleep, she would sit in a wooden chair she had pulled up beside him. She did not sleep. She watched. After the first day, Martha brought her a bag from the boarding house. It contained a change of clothes and, tucked inside, the red wool shirt Elara had been mending. Without a word, Elara took out her sewing kit, and in the quiet, lamp-lit hours of the vigil, while the blizzard howled outside and a man lay broken a few feet away, she began to sew. Her hands, which had been trembling, grew steady with the familiar, repetitive motion. The tiny, even stitches were a small act of faith, a quiet insistence on order in the face of chaos. She was mending his shirt while the doctor mended his body. It was the only thing she knew how to do, the only way she knew how to pray. She read to him from a book of verses she found on the doctor's shelf, her voice low and even, a thread of sound in the quiet room. When his fever was at its worst, she went to the doctor's small kitchen and made a thin, nourishing broth, feeding it to him one spoonful at a time. She did it all without a single word of complaint. She never spoke of her own fear, or of the bone-deep weariness that settled into her. She simply did what needed to be done. She had been brought to this town by the promise of a man who wanted a decorative, petite wife, and she had stayed to become the bedrock for a man who needed a partner with a very, very strong hand. The blizzard broke on the third day. The wind died, leaving behind a world of profound and absolute silence. Swathed in a layer of new snow so deep it transformed the familiar shapes of Silver Creek into soft, rolling dunes of white. The sun emerged, pale and watery, casting long, blue shadows across the pristine landscape. Inside the small clinic, a different kind of storm had passed. Gabriel's fever had broken during the second night, and the ragged, shallow breathing of a man fighting for his life had been replaced by the slow, steady rhythm of deep, healing sleep. The immediate crisis was over, but the long, arduous road of recovery had just begun. The clinic became Elara's world. Her sewing corner at the boarding house lay dormant. Her own life paused. She moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency within the small room, a space that now felt as familiar as her own skin. Her days were a litany of small, essential tasks: changing Gabriel's bandages, cleaning the angry, healing wound on his head, helping Doctor Adams check the splint on his shattered leg, preparing the thin broths and gruels that were his only nourishment. Gabriel was lucid more often now. He would wake, his dark eyes clear and aware, and watch her as she moved about the room. He spoke little, the effort still exhausting him, but his gaze was a constant presence. It followed her as she stoked the fire, as she folded clean linens, as she sat in the chair by his bed, her hands busy mending one of the logger's shirts, a task she had brought with her from the boarding house. Needing the familiar comfort of the needle and thread, she would read to him in the long, quiet afternoons, her voice a low, steady murmur against the backdrop of the crackling stove. She read from the doctor's small collection of books: Shakespeare, verses from the Bible, articles from old newspapers. It didn't matter what the words were. It was the sound of her voice that seemed to soothe him, to be a balm against the constant, grinding pain. One evening, 4 or 5 days after the accident, the room was steeped in the warm, golden glow of a single oil lamp. Dr. Adams had gone to make his rounds, and they were alone. Elara had just finished spooning a few mouthfuls of broth into Gabriel, and she was wiping his chin with a soft cloth. He was weak, his body a geography of pain, but his eyes were sharp and focused on her face. "You ran through the storm," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. It wasn't a question. Elara's hand stilled. "Jed said you were hurt." "You could have died out there," he rasped. a flicker of the old strength in his voice. It was a fool thing to do. She looked at him, at the vulnerability in his face, the raw truth of his brokenness, all the carefully constructed walls of propriety, all the polite distance between a man and a woman, seemed to have been washed away in the crucible of the past few days. "Perhaps," she said softly, "but I think it would have been a much more foolish thing to have stayed behind." A long silence stretched between them. His eyes held hers, and in their dark depths, she saw a universe of things she couldn't yet name: gratitude, wonder, and something else, something deeper and more fragile. His hand, which had been lying limp on the quilt, moved just an inch or two, a gesture of immense effort. She understood. She placed her own hand over his. His skin was cool, his grip astonishingly weak, yet the connection was electric. "Before the accident," he whispered, his voice so quiet she had to lean closer to hear. "When I was up on the ridge, I found myself thinking of you." He paused, gathering his strength. "Every day, I would look down at the smoke from the town and wonder what you were doing. If you were at your window, I thought of our dance." Ilara's heart seemed to stop, then restart with a painful, powerful surge. The air grew thick, charged with his confession. It was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to her. Her throat was tight with emotion. She couldn't speak, so she simply tightened her grip on his hand, pouring all of her unvoiced feelings into that small, simple pressure. He seemed to understand. His eyes softened. "Is it always like this?" he murmured, a faint, wry smile touching his lips. "The world falls apart, and only then do you see what truly holds it together." "I don't know," she whispered back, finding her voice at last. "This is my first blizzard." And then, because his honesty demanded her own, she added, "And I thought of you too." A look of profound peace settled on his face. His eyelids grew heavy, the effort of the conversation finally claiming him. He drifted back to sleep, his hand still loosely holding hers. Ilara sat there for a long time, the oil lamp casting their joined hands in a halo of golden light, feeling a quiet, tectonic shift in the foundation of her world. Their fragile peace was disturbed the next afternoon. The town was slowly digging itself out, paths were being shoveled, and life was beginning to stir again. The clinic door opened, and a woman entered, carrying a basket covered with a linen cloth. She was a striking figure, with hair the color of corn silk piled neatly under a fashionable bonnet, and a trim, corseted figure that was the epitome of feminine delicacy. It was Mary O'Connell, the daughter of the general store's owner. Ilara knew who she was. Martha's gentle but informative chatter had already supplied the details. Mary and Gabriel had, for a time, been considered an item, an understanding. It was a match that made perfect sense to the town, the prosperous merchant's daughter and the ambitious, successful logger. Nothing had ever been announced, and Gabriel had seemed to cool on the idea the previous summer, but the town's expectations lingered. "I heard the dreadful news," Mary said, her voice a musical, concerned lilt. She addressed Dr. Adams, but her sharp blue eyes were fixed on Ilara, taking in her simple dress, her tired face, and her position by Gabriel's bedside. "I've brought some proper beef broth and some calf's foot jelly. He'll need to build up his strength." She was performing. Her concern was a public display, her charity a claim of territory. She swept over to the bed, her movements full of a proprietary grace. Gabriel was awake, and a flicker of something annoyance, perhaps, or resignation crossed his face. "Mary," he said, his voice flat. "That's kind of you." "Oh, Gabriel, you poor man," she cooed, placing a cool hand on his forehead. It was a gesture of practiced intimacy, and it made Ilara's stomach clench. "We were all so worried. You must let us take care of you now." She turned to Ilara, her smile bright but brittle. "It was so good of you to help the doctor during the storm. Miss Vance."
But you must be exhausted. I can take over now. You should go back to the boarding house and rest. It was a dismissal, polite and perfectly phrased, but a dismissal all the same. She was being sent back to her corner, her role as the emergency caregiver now concluded. Elara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter outside, but then she looked at Gabriel. His eyes met hers over Mary's fussing form, and he gave a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Stay," the look said. "That is very kind, Miss O'Connell," Elara said, her voice even and calm. She did not rise from her chair. "But Dr. Adam still requires my assistance, and I have not yet finished mending Mr. Blackwood's shirt." She held up the red wool. The needle still threaded. It was a simple, domestic tool. But in that moment, it felt like a weapon, a statement. "I have a place here. I have a purpose." Mary's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Her blue eyes, which had been full of public sympathy, hardened into something flinty and assessing as she looked at Elara. The change was swift and startling. She saw a rival. And so began the quiet, undeclared war of the sick room. Mary became a constant visitor. She would arrive each day, her basket full of offerings, her manner a performance of devoted care. She would plump pillows Elara had just settled. She would offer Gabriel a sip of her broth moments after he had finished Elara's. She filled the small room with bright, incessant chatter about town affairs, a world of gossip and social minutiae that excluded Elara completely. The town noticed. Of course it noticed. There was little else to talk about. The whispers started. Quiet at first, then more bold. Friends of Mary's would stop by the clinic to offer their sympathies to Gabriel, and their eyes would slide from Mary's solicitous form to the tall, silent woman sitting in the corner with her sewing, and a look of speculation, of disapproval, would pass between them. Who did she think she was? This outsider, this strange, oversized woman, to install herself at Gabriel Blackwood's bedside as if she had the right Mary was the one who belonged there. She was one of them. The story of Elara's arrival, of her public rejection by William Prescott, was retold and embellished. She was an adventuress, they whispered, a woman of no standing who was trying to trap Silver Creek's most eligible man while he was weak and helpless. Elara heard the whispers. She felt the cold stares when she made her brief daily trips to the boarding house to bathe and change. She saw the way women would stop talking when she entered the general store. The carefully constructed place she had built for herself was beginning to feel precarious, threatened by a tide of public opinion. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to go back to the safety of her sewing corner and let the town have its way. It would be the easier path, the path of least resistance. But she would look at Gabriel, at the way his eyes sought her out the moment she entered the room, at the way his whole body seemed to relax when she sat beside him and picked up her book to read. She would remember his whispered words in the lamplight. "I thought of you every day," and she would not move. Her defiance was quiet, but absolute. She did not engage Mary in arguments. She did not defend herself against the gossip. She simply stayed. She continued her work, her movements calm and unhurried. She met Mary's sharp glances with a steady, neutral gaze. She answered the townswomen's prying questions with a polite, impenetrable dignity. Her presence became an act of passive, immovable resistance. The clinic, the small room with its scent of carbolic acid and wood smoke, became their sanctuary. When the door was closed and the visitors were gone, the tension would drain away, leaving a quiet, intimate peace in its wake. They found a new rhythm, a silent language built of small gestures, the way he would watch her hands as she sewed, the way she would know he needed a drink of water before he asked, the way she would adjust his pillows, her touch gentle and sure, and the way his eyes would close in gratitude. One evening, after a particularly trying day where Mary and two of her friends had held court in the room for over an hour, the silence they left behind was heavy.
Gabriel had been quiet and withdrawn throughout the visit, his face a tight mask of pain and frustration. Ilara was sitting in her usual chair, her sewing lying untouched in her lap. The weight of the town's disapproval felt heavier than usual. "You should not have to endure this," Gabriel said suddenly, his voice low and angry. He stared at the ceiling. "The way they look at you, the things they're saying."
"I don't mind,"
she lied, but her voice was not entirely steady. "Don't," he said, turning his head to look at her, his gaze intense. "Don't lie to me, Ilara, not you." He took a breath. "It is my fault. I have put you in an impossible position." "You have done nothing of the sort," she said, her voice firming. "You were injured. I helped. That is the beginning and the end of it."
"Is it?"
he asked softly. She met his gaze, and the truth was there between them, unspoken but undeniable. It was not the end of it. It was the beginning. "They will talk," she said, finally acknowledging the enemy at their gates. "It is what people do in small towns." "Does it frighten you?" he asked, his voice full of a raw concern that was entirely for her. She considered the question. A month ago, it would have terrified her. The thought of being the subject of such intense, negative scrutiny would have sent her running. But something had changed. Sitting here, in this room, she had found a strange and unexpected courage. She had faced down a blizzard. She could face down a room full of gossips. "No," she said, and she was surprised to find that it was the truth. "No, not anymore." He held out his hand. She placed hers in it. His grip was stronger now, his fingers closing around hers with a comforting warmth and pressure. They sat in the quiet, lamp-lit room, their hands joined, while the town whispered outside their door. They had found their peace, a small, fiercely guarded island in a sea of speculation. And for now, it was enough. The low, urgent murmur of a single topic had replaced the usual town gossip. It wasn't about Gabriel's accident or the quiet scandal of Ilara's vigil. It was about money, progress, and the railroad. Representatives from the Oregon and California Railroad had come to Silver Creek with a proposition, a gleaming, gilt-edged promise of prosperity that had cleaved the town neatly in two. They wanted to buy the logging rights to the entire Blackwood Ridge and the surrounding forests to supply ties for a new spur line. The offer was a fortune. For merchants like Mr. O'Connell and men of property like William Prescott, it was the key to the future, a direct link to the markets in Portland and beyond. A flood of new jobs, the transformation of their provincial backwater into a proper, prosperous town. For others, for the independent loggers, the homesteaders, and the families who had carved their lives directly from the forest. It was a death sentence. It meant the end of their way of life, the destruction of the wilderness that sustained them, and their subservience to a faceless corporation from the city. A town meeting was called. The vote would decide everything. In the small clinic room, which had become Gabriel's temporary home, the tension was a palpable thing. He had been slowly, painfully, regaining his strength. With Ilara's and Dr. Adams's help, he could now sit in a chair for an hour at a time and was beginning to navigate the small space on a pair of rough-hewn crutches. But the news of the railroad proposal had set his recovery back. He was consumed by a restless, feverish energy, a frustration so profound it seemed to hinder his healing. "They mean to sell the whole ridge," he said for the 10th time, his knuckles white where he gripped the arms of his chair. He stared out the window at the familiar, snow-covered pines. O'Connell and Prescott see a pile of dollars. They don't see the trees. They don't see the watershed that feeds every farm in this valley. They don't see the next generation. "You cannot go, Gabriel," Ilara said, her voice gentle but firm. She was darning a sock, the simple, repetitive motion a small anchor in the turbulent room. "You can barely stand. Doctor. Adams said any exertion could—" "And if I don't go," he countered, his voice a low growl, "who will speak for the ridge, for the men who work for me? For this town's soul, Prescott will charm them with his talk of progress. and O'Connell will blind them with his ledger books. They'll sell our future for a handful of coins. She knew he was right. She had seen the way William Prescott operated, his smooth words and condescending smiles, and she knew that Gabriel's voice, his presence, was the only one in town with the weight to counter him. The evening of the meeting, the air in the clinic was thick with a grim resolve. Jed and another of Gabriel's loggers, a quiet giant of a man named Silas, arrived to help. Getting Gabriel dressed was an agonizing ordeal. Every movement sent a fresh wave of pain through him, and his face went pale with the effort, beads of sweat standing out on his forehead. Alara's heart ached to see him so diminished, yet so fiercely determined. She felt a surge of protective anger at the men who were forcing this upon him. The journey to the church hall was a slow, torturous procession through the packed snow of the main street. Gabriel leaned heavily on Silas on one side and his crutch on the other, his shattered leg held stiffly in front of him. Alara walked beside him, carrying a lantern, her eyes scanning the path for treacherous patches of ice. They were a strange, wounded company, and their slow march drew stares from the people hurrying towards the meeting. The hall was packed, every bench full, with men standing 3 deep along the walls. The air was hot, close, and smelled of wet wool and nervous sweat. A palpable line was drawn down the center of the room. On one side sat the merchants and their supporters, looking confident and prosperous. On the other were the loggers, the farmers, and their families, their faces grim and worried. When Gabriel entered, a hush fell over the entire assembly. Every head turned, the sight of him pale, leaning on a crutch, his arm in a sling. A fresh scar visible at his hairline was a dramatic, powerful statement. He was the living embodiment of the forest's dangers, a man literally broken by the life they were all there to debate. William Prescott, standing at the front of the room by a trestle table, faltered for a moment, his smug expression replaced by one of irritation. Gabriel's presence was a complication he had not anticipated. Silas and Jed cleared a path, and they found a space for Gabriel to sit at the end of a bench near the front. He sank onto the hard wood with a barely suppressed groan, his face ashen. Alara remained standing beside him, a silent, tall guardian. She felt the curious, resentful eyes of Mary O'Connell and her friends on her, but she ignored them. Her focus was entirely on Gabriel. The meeting began. Mr. O'Connell spoke first, his arguments practical and persuasive. He spoke of jobs, of growth, of the money the railroad would bring, money that would build a new school and a proper bridge. He painted a picture of a bright, modern future for Silver Creek. Then William Prescott took the floor. He was in his element, his voice smooth and condescending. He spoke of manifest destiny, of taming the wilderness, of Silver Creek taking its rightful place in a great and growing nation. He dismissed the opposition with a wave of his hand. "There are always those who fear the future," he said, his eyes sweeping over the loggers and farmers. "Those who would rather cling to the past than embrace the promise of prosperity. But progress, gentlemen, is like a mighty river. You can either build a boat and ride its currents, or you can stand on the bank and be swept away." When he finished, there was a round of enthusiastic applause from his side of the room. The opposition sat in stony, frustrated silence. A few men tried to speak, but they were farmers, not orators. They stumbled over their words, speaking of their feelings, of their connection to the land, in a way that sounded sentimental and foolish after Prescott's slick performance. Finally, Gabriel pushed himself forward. "I would speak," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the tense silence. Slowly, painfully, he rose to his feet, leaning heavily on his crutch. He stood for a moment, gathering his strength. "Mr. Prescott speaks of progress," he began, his voice strained but clear. "But what is the cost of his progress? He sees this forest as timber, a commodity, something to be clear-cut and sold off to the highest bidder." He took a shaky breath. "But I have lived my life in that forest. It is not just timber. It is a living thing. It is the soil that holds our hills together, the water that feeds our streams. It is the heart of this place. You sell that heart, and this town will die, left with nothing but a pocketful of railroad money and a barren, empty mountain." He tried to say more, but a wave of dizziness washed over him. His color drained, and he swayed, his knuckles white on the crutch. He gritted his teeth, fighting it, but the pain and weakness were too much. He sank back onto the bench, his head bowed, defeated. A murmur of triumph went through Prescott's faction. The opposition's champion had fallen. The vote was a foregone conclusion. Prescott stepped forward, a smug, victorious smile on his lips. "If there is no further discussion," he began. "Wait." The voice was not loud, but it was so clear, so unexpected, that it cut through the room like a shard of glass. Every person in the hall turned. Elara was standing. She had moved away from Gabriel's side and stood in the aisle, tall and straight, her hands clasped in front of her. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break, but her face was a mask of calm resolve. "Miss Vance," the mayor said, looking flustered, "this is a town council matter, for the property holders." "I understand," Elara said, her voice gaining strength. "I am not a property holder. I am, by some standards, not even a citizen of this town. I have no official right to speak here." She paused, and her eyes found William Prescott's in the crowd. "When I first arrived in Silver Creek, I was made to understand that very clearly. I was told I did not fit, that I was not what was wanted here." A shocked silence fell over the room. Prescott's face went rigid. She had called him out, publicly and directly, on the memory of her humiliation. "I was rejected," she continued, her voice resonating with a power no one in the room had ever heard from her. "I was told to leave. I had every reason to turn my back on this town and never think of it again. But I did not." She let her gaze travel over the faces in the room, over the women whose dresses she had mended, over the loggers whose shirts she had patched, over Martha, who was watching her with tears in her eyes. I stayed because one man saw not an outcast, but a person. I stayed because a woman gave me shelter and a corner to work in. I stayed because the women of this town gave me their trust and their trade. I stayed and I worked. I put down roots, not in property, but in the community. I learned to live here." She took a deep breath, and her eyes found Gabriel's. He was watching her, his face full of a stunned, fierce pride. "And I learned to love here." The quiet admission hung in the hot, crowded air, a statement of profound and courageous vulnerability. "You are being asked tonight to make a choice," she went on, turning her attention back to the assembly. "Mr. Prescott and Mr. O'Connell offer you a simple choice. They offer you money, a ledger book with a handsome figure in the credit column. But what are you being asked to sell in exchange for it? You are being asked to sell the very thing that makes this town what it is. You are being asked to sell the independence that allows a man like Gabriel Blackwood to build a business from his own sweat. You are being asked to sell the wild beauty that sustains your spirit. You are being asked to sell the future, your children's future, for the convenience of the present." She stood taller, her voice ringing with passion. "Look around you. This town was not built by railroad money. It was built by courage. It was built by people who were not afraid of hardship, who chose this difficult, beautiful place and made it their own. That is your inheritance, not a stack of timber, but a legacy of strength and self-reliance. Do not sell it. Do not trade what is priceless for what is merely profitable. Protect the heart of this place. Protect your home." She finished, her chest heaving, her words echoing in the stunned, absolute silence of the church hall. No one moved. No one spoke. She had stripped the issue down to its bare, moral core, and her truth was unassailable. Slowly, the mayor, a man named Abernathy, cleared his throat. "The motion is on the floor," he said, his voice sounding awed. "To sell the timber rights for the Blackwood Ridge to the O&C Railroad. All in favor. Raise your hands." A scattering of hands went up on the merchant's side of the room. Prescott's and O'Connell's were among them. Abernathy counted, his lips moving silently. All opposed. A forest of hands shot up on the other side. But it was more than just the loggers and farmers now. Several men who had been sitting on the fence, men from the middle of the room, slowly, thoughtfully, raised their hands as well. The mayor counted again, his finger jabbing the air. The silence was agonizing. He recounted. Finally, he looked up, his face a mixture of shock and relief. "The motion is defeated," he announced, his voice cracking. 38 to 35. The room exploded. A roar of triumph went up from the homesteaders and loggers. Men were clapping each other on the back, cheering, stamping their feet. On the other side of the room, Prescott stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and pure fury. He shot Alara a look of venomous hatred before turning and storming out of the hall. Amid the chaos, Alara felt a hand gently take hers. She looked down. It was Gabriel. He had pulled himself to his feet again and was looking at her, his face exhausted, pale, but shining with a light she had never seen before. The noise of the celebration, the angry muttering of the defeated, it all faded away. He squeezed her hand, his thumb stroking the back of her palm. He leaned closer, his voice for her alone. "You did it, Alara," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You did it." The move from the sterile, medicinal-smelling clinic to the familiar warmth of Martha's boarding house was a significant milestone. It felt like a return to the world of the living. Gabriel's loggers, with a reverence that bordered on the comical, carried their injured boss up the stairs as if he were made of fine porcelain. Martha, meanwhile, orchestrated the entire operation with the authority of a field marshal, directing the placement of the bed, the stoking of the stove, and the airing of the room until it met her exacting standards. Gabriel was given the best room in the house, a corner space with 2 large windows that looked out over the main street on one side and the vast, silent expanse of the forest on the other. It was a room full of light, a cheerful, hopeful space that stood in stark contrast to the grim functionality of the clinic. And it was here, in this room, that a new, quieter chapter of his recovery and their relationship began. The dynamic of their time together shifted. The desperate life-or-death urgency was gone, replaced by the slow, steady rhythm of healing. Alara's role evolved from that of a frantic, makeshift nurse to something quieter, deeper, and far more complex. She was his caregiver, yes, but she was also his companion, his confidant, his sole link to the world beyond the 4 walls of his room. Their days fell into a pattern, a quiet domesticity that was both comforting and fraught with unspoken emotion. She would bring him his breakfast tray in the morning, her movements calm and efficient as she set it on the small table beside his bed. While he ate, she would sit in the armchair by the window, her hands busy with the mending she now did exclusively in his room. The rhythmic snip of her scissors and the soft rasp of thread through fabric becoming the familiar soundtrack to their mornings. Afternoons were for his exercises, grueling sessions prescribed by doctor, atoms that were a battle between Gabriel's iron will and his body's profound weakness. He would grit his teeth, his face slick with sweat. As he tried to put weight on his healing leg, Alara would be there, a steady, silent presence, her hand on his arm to support him, offering a quiet word of encouragement when his frustration threatened to overwhelm him. In these moments, there was no room for propriety, only the raw, unadorned reality of his struggle and her steadfast support. But it was the evenings that became their own. After the supper trays were cleared and the boarding house settled into a quiet hush, a different kind of stillness would descend upon the room. This was when the careful, necessary boundaries between patient and caregiver would blur, leaving only a man and a woman in the warm glow of the lamplight. They played cards. Martha had an old, worn deck. The kings and queens faded from years of use, and a checkerboard with mismatched pieces. They would sit for hours at the small table. The game a simple, welcome distraction. But it was never just about the game. It was about the small, incidental gestures that the game allowed. The brief touch of their fingers as he dealt the cards. The way she would bite her lip in concentration. A gesture he found endlessly endearing. The way he would lean back and laugh. A deep, genuine sound that was the surest sign of his returning health. A sound that made Alara's heart feel impossibly full. Their conversations were a careful dance around the one subject that truly mattered. They talked of books, of the news from the Portland papers, of the personalities of his loggers, of the changing seasons. They learned the topography of each other's minds, the rhythms of each other's thoughts, but the powerful, unspoken feelings that had been growing since the blizzard, since his whispered confession in the clinic, remained a palpable presence in the room, a beautiful, heavy weight in the air between them. She would look up from her cards and find him simply watching her, his dark eyes full of an emotion so potent it made her breath catch. He would stop mid-sentence, his train of thought lost as he watched the firelight catch in her hair. They were like two people standing on opposite banks of a river of propriety and circumstance, with a deep, powerful current of emotion flowing between them, and neither knew how to build the bridge. He was a man still broken, and he would not presume upon the kindness of the woman who had saved him. And she, for her part, was still charting her course in this town, unwilling to risk the quiet dignity she had fought so hard to win. And so, they lived in the warmth of what was, and the quiet, aching hope of what might be. The outside world, however, was not content to leave their small sanctuary in peace. The town's reaction to their victory at the council meeting had been a complicated one. While many admired Alara's courage, her actions had also drawn a line in the sand. Those who had stood to profit from the railroad deal, a powerful and vocal minority, now saw her not just as an outsider, but as an enemy. And their anger had a focal point. A leader who was nursing a deep and personal wound, William Prescott. He chose his moment perfectly. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon. A light snow was falling, muffling the sounds of the street outside. Gabriel was dozing in his chair by the fire, and Alara was reading. The room steeped in a comfortable, sleepy peace. There was no knock. The door was simply pushed open, and William Prescott strode into the room. He brought the chill of the outside world with him. He was dressed impeccably, his coat brushed free of snow, his boots polished. He looked around the cozy room, at the checkerboard on the table, at the book in Alara's lap, at the sleeping man by the fire, and his lips curled into a disdainful sneer. "Well, isn't this a touching domestic scene?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Gabriel's eyes snapped open. He was instantly awake and alert, his body tensing as he tried to push himself up. "Prescott," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Get out." Now, Blackwood. Is that any way to greet a concerned citizen?" Prescott said, his tone mocking. He took another step into the room, his gaze fixing on Alara. She had not moved from her chair, her book still open in her hands, but her spine was ramrod straight. "I was just coming to see how our town's wounded hero was faring, and to offer a bit of friendly advice." "I don't need any advice from you," Gabriel said, gripping the arms of his chair, his face tight with a mixture of anger and the pain the sudden movement had caused him. Prescott ignored him, his full attention now on Alara. He walked slowly towards her, circling the table, his movements like those of a predator cornering its prey. "You are to be commended, Miss Vance," he said, his voice a soft, menacing purr. "Quite the performance you gave at the meeting. You have a real talent for theatrics. You managed to sway a room full of simple-minded fools with your little sob story." Alara met his gaze without flinching. "I told the truth. Mr. Prescott, Perhaps that is what they found so convincing. A flash of raw anger crossed Prescott's face before he masked it with his condescending smile. "The truth," he scoffed. "Let me tell you the truth, Miss Vance. You have made some powerful enemies in this town. You cost people a great deal of money, and people with money do not like to be trifled with." He stopped directly in front of her chair, forcing her to look up at him. "A woman's reputation is a fragile thing in a place like this," he continued, his voice dropping lower. "Especially for a woman with no family, no connections, a woman who installs herself in a bachelor's sick room, day after day." He let the insinuation hang in the air. "I have heard the whispers. Soon, the women who give you their mending will hear them too, and they will stop coming. Business at the general store might become difficult for your landlady. Credit for a certain logger might become impossible to secure. A town has ways of correcting a problem." It was a declaration of war, a cold, calculated threat to destroy everything she had built, and to punish anyone who had shown her kindness. "Get out!" Gabriel snarled again, his voice cracking with the effort of trying to rise. He managed to get one foot under him, but his injured leg buckled, and he fell back into the chair with a sharp cry of pain. He was helpless, and the look of pure, impotent fury on his face was terrible to see. Prescott saw it too, and he smiled, a cruel, triumphant smile. He had won. He had proven his power, proven that Gabriel, for all his strength, could not protect her. But he had made a critical miscalculation. He had mistaken her quietness for meekness. He had mistaken her patience for passivity. Slowly, deliberately, Alara placed a piece of ribbon in her book to mark her page. She closed it with a soft, final thud, and then she stood up. She rose to her full height, unfolding from the chair in one long, fluid motion. She was a good head taller than him, and as she straightened her shoulders, she seemed to draw all the light and air in the room to herself. The tired, gentle caregiver vanished, and in her place was a figure of formidable, immovable strength. Her face, which had been a mask of calm composure, was now set in lines of cold, crystalline anger. Her eyes, usually so soft and observant, were like chips of ice. William Prescott's triumphant smile faltered. He instinctively took a half-step back. He had come here to threaten a mouse, and he had found himself face to face with a lioness. Alara looked down at him, her gaze so cold and direct that he flinched. When she spoke, her voice was not loud. It was a low, quiet, and utterly chilling sound, a voice that carried the weight of every insult and every hardship she had ever endured. "Be careful, Mr. Prescott," she said, each word a perfectly enunciated drop of ice. "You are making a very common mistake." She took a single, deliberate step towards him, and he took another involuntary step back. "You are mistaking kindness for weakness." The silence in the room was absolute. The statement was so simple, so direct, and so utterly true that it left no room for argument. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, a final, damning assessment of his character. He had built his power on the assumption that kindness, especially in a woman, was a flaw to be exploited. In 3 seconds, she had dismantled his entire worldview. For the first time since she had met him, William Prescott was utterly speechless. His face flushed a deep, mottled red. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked from her cold, unyielding face to the furious, but now awestruck, face of the man in the chair. He had lost, and he knew it. There was no recovery from this. With a strangled sound of pure rage and humiliation, he turned and practically fled from the room, slamming the door behind him. The quiet that descended in his wake was profound. Alara stood for a long moment, her back to Gabriel, her shoulders slowly relaxing from their rigid posture. Her heart was pounding, a wild drum against her ribs. She took a deep, shuddering breath. From his chair, Gabriel stared at her back, at the proud, straight line of her spine, He had seen her strength before, but this was something else. This was a raw, elemental power he had never suspected. He had thought he was her protector, but in that moment, when he was at his most helpless, she had risen, and she had protected them both. The town had seen her kindness, her skill, her quiet dignity, and her surprising eloquence. But in the privacy of that small, warm room, Gabriel Blackwood was the first to witness her true, formidable, and magnificent strength. And he was utterly, irrevocably, in awe. The aftermath of Alara's confrontation with William Prescott was not what she might have naively hoped for. There was no sudden wave of public support, no collective apology from the townspeople. Instead, Prescott, robbed of his ability to intimidate her directly, resorted to a more insidious and cowardly weapon poison. He began to poison the well of public opinion, and his venom spread through Silver Creek with a chilling efficiency. The whispers that had once been speculative now became hard, ugly accusations. The narrative, carefully curated by Prescott and amplified by the O'Connell family and their allies, was simple and damning. Alara Vance was not a woman of quiet strength. She was a cunning opportunist. She was an adventuress of low character who had failed to trap one respectable man and, seeing a better opportunity, had attached herself to another while he was grievously injured and not in his right mind. She had bewitched him, they said, using his weakness to insinuate herself into his life with the aim of getting her hands on his timber claim. Her speech at the town meeting was not an act of civic courage, but a calculated performance to secure her own interests by protecting his. The change in the town's demeanor was a palpable, daily assault. When Alara walked to the general store, conversations would cease, replaced by a hostile silence. Women who had once greeted her with friendly chatter about their sewing projects would now turn their backs, busying themselves with a bolt of fabric or a barrel of flour. The blacksmith's wife, Sarah, for whom she had made the blue calico dress, would now only offer a tight, pained nod before hurrying away. Each snub was a small, sharp paper cut on the sole. Mary O'Connell continued her daily visits to the boarding house, her performance of concern now tinged with a righteous, pitying air. She treated Alara with a cloying sweetness that was more insulting than open hostility. "You must be so tired, Miss Vance," she would say, her voice loud enough for anyone in the parlor to hear. "It is such a burden for you to be cooped up in that room all day. Do let me sit with Gabriel for a while so you can get some fresh air." It was an offer of a cage, not of freedom. A constant reinforcement of the idea that Alara was an employee, a hired nurse, while Mary was the rightful companion. William Prescott, for his part, had perfected the art of the silent insult. He no longer needed to speak to her. Whenever their paths crossed on the street, he would stop, a slow, knowing smirk spreading across his face. It was a look of pure, triumphant malice. It said, "I warned you. I told you what this town does to people who don't fit. See, I was right." The pressure was immense, a constant, grinding weight on her spirit. There were moments, late at night, when she would sit in her own small room after Gabriel was asleep, and the loneliness would feel like a physical presence. The temptation to flee was a seductive whisper in the dark. It would be so easy to pack her small valise, to use the money she had carefully saved, and to board the morning train. She could disappear, find a new city, a new life where no one knew her name or her story, where she was not defined by her height or by the scandals invented for her. But then she would think of Gabriel. She would think of his hand in hers, of the look in his eyes when he watched her, of the sound of his laughter filling the quiet room. She would think of the stubborn, hard-won dignity she had found here, in this cold, difficult town. To leave now would be to let William Prescott win. It would be to agree with his assessment of her, that she was weak, that her kindness was a flaw, that she did not belong. And so, with a quiet, mulish stubbornness that was the very core of her character. She stayed. Her defiance was not loud or dramatic. It was woven into the fabric of her daily routine. Her rebellion was in the steady, unwavering continuation of her life. She would wake each morning, dress with care, and walk to the general store with her head held high, meeting the cold stares with a calm, neutral gaze that gave them nothing. She would return to the boarding house and carry Gabriel's breakfast tray up the stairs, her steps unhurried and deliberate. The small room had become their fortress, a world of two sealed off from the hostility outside. Her continued care for him became an act of gentle, stubborn love. She would change the linens on his bed, her hands smoothing the sheets with a crisp, satisfying efficiency that was a small act of imposing order on a chaotic world. She would cook for him, coaxing Martha to let her use the kitchen to make the savory stews and nourishing soups that were helping him regain his strength. She would sit with him for hours, her needle and thread flashing as she worked on the endless pile of mending for his men. Her quiet, productive presence, a constant reassurance. The ritual of reading aloud became their most cherished sanctuary. She would open a book, and the ugly whispers of Silver Creek would fade, replaced by the grand tragedies of Shakespeare or the sweeping adventures of Sir Walter Scott. For an hour or two, they could leave the confines of their small room and travel to ancient Scotland or Elizabethan England, their minds united in the shared landscape of a story. In these moments, the world was not a hostile town in the Oregon wilderness, but a place of endless possibility. Gabriel watched it all, and his heart ached for her. He saw the toll the town's cruelty was taking. He saw the faint, new lines of strain around her eyes, the way her smile sometimes didn't quite reach them. He saw the deep, weary breath she would take when she closed the door to his room, shutting the outside world away. He was a prisoner in his own broken body, unable to stand for her, to fight for her in the way he longed to. All he could do was offer her the sanctuary of his presence, the unwavering truth in his eyes. He tried to speak of it once, to apologize for what she was enduring on his behalf, but she had stopped him. "This is my choice, Gabriel," she had said, her voice soft but unyielding. "Do not take it away from me." And so he watched, and he healed, and he loved her with a silent, desperate intensity. One night, the wind was howling outside, a low, mournful sound that seemed to seep through the walls. A fresh layer of snow was falling, burying the town once more in a blanket of white. They had finished their quiet supper, and Alara had been reading from a collection of poems, her voice a low counterpoint to the wind's cry. She closed the book, the silence in the room suddenly profound. The lamplight cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. She looked tired, her shoulders slumped just slightly. She thought he was asleep, but when she glanced at him, his eyes were open, watching her, his expression full of a deep, troubled tenderness. "Are you afraid, Alara?" he asked, his voice a low murmur in the quiet room. The question was so simple, so direct, that it caught her off guard. She looked at him, and she knew he was not just asking about the wind or the dark. He was asking about Prescott's sneer, about Mary's false pity, about the cold shoulders in the street. He was asking if the cost of being with him, of staying here, was becoming too high. He was giving her an opportunity to confess her pain, an opportunity to leave. She thought of the fear that had been her constant companion when she first arrived, a cold knot of anxiety in her stomach, the fear of rejection, of solitude, of failure. She thought of the sting of the town's gossip, the loneliness of being an outcast. She felt the echo of it, a faint, phantom pain. But then she looked at him, at his honest, worried face in the warm lamplight. She thought of the strength she had discovered within herself, a resilience she never knew she possessed. The fear was still there, a shadow at the edges of her world, but it was no longer the center of it. Something larger, warmer, and infinitely more powerful had grown in its place. "No," she said, her voice clear and steady. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, a look of quiet wonder on her face as she realized the absolute truth of the words she was about to speak. "No, not anymore." A look of profound relief washed over his features. The tension he had been holding in his shoulders seemed to melt away. He slowly, deliberately, reached out his hand towards her. She took it without hesitation. His hand was warm and calloused, his grip still gentle. It was a familiar, comforting gesture, one they had shared many times in this room. But this time, something was different. He took her hand, a silent offering of comfort and support. And for the first time, she squeezed back. It was not a strong pressure, but it was definite. It was a conscious, deliberate act. It was an answer to a question he had not dared to ask. It was a promise. It was the closing of a circuit, the final, mutual acknowledgement of the powerful, unspoken current that had flowed between them for so long. He felt the gentle pressure, and his breath hitched. He looked from their joined hands back to her face. Her eyes were shining in the lamplight, and in their depths, he saw not fear, not doubt, but a quiet, stubborn, and magnificent love. He tightened his own grip, and they sat there for a long time in the heart of the storm, holding on. Two stubborn, gentle souls who had found their anchor in a hostile world. The world was born new that morning. The heavy, oppressive gray of the long winter had finally broken, and a dawn of crystalline purity was spreading across the snowbound landscape. The sky was a pale, incandescent blue, so clear and cold it seemed fragile enough to shatter. Sunlight, thin but brilliant, struck the deep drifts of snow, scattering millions of tiny, diamond-like sparks across their surface. Every roof in Silver Creek wore a thick, immaculate blanket of white, and from every eave hung a neat, glittering row of icicles. The air was still, scrubbed clean, and so cold it felt sharp and vital in the lungs. On the front porch of Martha's boarding house, Elara was hanging Gabriel's heavy winter coat on a hook to air out in the crisp morning sun. It was the coat he had been wearing the day of the accident, the one his men had cut from his body. She had spent countless hours painstakingly repairing it, replacing a whole panel of the back, reinforcing the seams, lining the collar with a piece of soft, new wool. The work had been a quiet, meditative act, a way of piecing him back together while his body did the same. Now, holding the familiar, heavy garment in her hands, it felt less like an object of mending and more like a symbol of their shared journey through the darkness. It was whole again. She smoothed the shoulder of the coat, her fingers lingering on the thick fabric. A profound and quiet sense of peace had settled within her. The town's gossip had not ceased, but it had lost its power to wound her. It was just noise now, the meaningless chatter of an unhappy few, and it could not penetrate the walls of the fortress she and Gabriel had built together in his small, warm room. She was no longer the frightened outcast, the woman who didn't fit. She was Elara. She had a place, a purpose. She belonged. A small, genuine smile touched her lips as she breathed in the clean, cold air. The soft, rhythmic thump of wood on wood broke the morning silence. It was a hesitant, uneven sound, but one that made her heart leap. She turned. Gabriel was standing in the open doorway, leaning on his crutches. It was the first time he had come downstairs, the first time he had ventured out of his room on his own. He had dressed himself, not in a nightshirt, but in a clean shirt and trousers. His hair was combed, and he had shaved that morning. She could see the faint, clean line of his jaw. He was still pale, and his frame was leaner than it had been, but the look in his eyes was one of resolute strength. He was no longer a patient. He was a man reclaiming his life. He looked at her, standing there in the brilliant morning light, and a slow, quiet smile spread across his face. "Good morning," he said, his voice still a little rough, but deeper and more resonant than it had been in weeks. "Gabriel," she breathed, a sudden, fierce joy surging through her. "You shouldn't be
Is it wise?
Doctor, Adam said I needed to start moving. He replied, taking a slow, careful step out onto the porch. The end of his crutch made a solid thump on the wooden planks. And I decided this was where I needed to move to. He began to make his way towards her. It was a slow, arduous journey of only a few feet. Each step was a deliberate, concentrated effort of will. He had to swing his injured leg, still stiff and awkward, and find a new point of balance before moving the crutches forward again. He did not look down. His gaze remained fixed on her face, his dark eyes full of a quiet, unwavering purpose. She had to clench her hands at her sides to stop herself from rushing forward, from putting her arm around him and helping him. She knew, instinctively, that this was a journey he had to make by himself. He finally came to a stop in front of her. So close she could see the fine lines around his eyes, could feel the faint warmth radiating from his body in the cold air. Their breath plumed between them in soft, white clouds. He was breathing a little heavily from the exertion, but his eyes were shining.
Ilara,
he whispered, and the way he said her name was different from all the other times. It was not a call for help, not a murmur of gratitude, not a word spoken in the delirium of fever. It was a statement, a beginning and an end. It was the only word in the world. She felt the sound of it settle deep within her. It was the key that unlocked the final, guarded door in her heart. She didn't speak. She couldn't. She could only look at him, her own feelings a clear, open book in her eyes. He stood there for a long, silent moment, leaning on his crutches, simply looking at her as if seeing her for the first time in this new, clean light. And then, very slowly, he let go of one of his crutches. It teetered for a second before clattering loudly onto the wooden porch, the sound unnaturally sharp in the stillness. He swayed, his balance precarious, and reached out, his hand finding the wall of the house to steady himself. And then he lifted his free hand. He didn't touch her face or her arm. He simply took her hand, the one that had been resting on the mended coat, his fingers, calloused and strong, laced through hers. It was not the weak, grasping hand of an invalid, but the firm, confident grip of a man who knew exactly what he wanted. He didn't pull her into a desperate, cinematic embrace. The gesture was smaller, quieter, and infinitely more profound. He simply drew her hand towards him, a gentle, inexorable pressure that invited her to close the small space that remained between them. She took the final step. Leaning his weight against the wall and the single crutch, he lowered his head, and she tilted hers up to meet him. Their foreheads touched. The contact was a quiet explosion, the warmth of his skin against hers in the frigid air, the faint, clean scent of his soap, the feeling of his breath, soft and warm against her cheek. She closed her eyes. The entire world, the whole vast, cold, beautiful, and cruel world, vanished, shrinking to this single, perfect point of contact. All the pain, all the loneliness, all the fear she had ever known, all the quiet strength and stubborn hope she had nurtured, it all led to this moment of absolute, unquestionable peace. A single tear escaped from under her closed eyelid and traced a hot path down her cold cheek. Her breath hitched in her throat, a soft, broken sound. "Is it always like this?" she whispered, her voice a thread of pure, wondering emotion. The question was not for him, but for the universe itself. Is this what it feels like? This feeling of being utterly and completely seen, of having a place, a home, not in a building or a town, but in the small, sacred space between two people. Gabriel didn't answer with words. He didn't need to. He simply smiled, a smile she could feel more than see, a deep, slow, knowing smile that radiated through the point where their foreheads met. It was a smile that held all the answers, all the promises, all the quiet, patient love he had kept locked in his heart. And then, with a strength she hadn't felt in his touch before, he pulled her closer, his arm sliding from the wall to wrap around her waist, drawing her flush against his side. It was an embrace of homecoming, a silent declaration that their long, separate journeys had finally led them to the same destination. They stood there on the cold, sunlit porch, two tall, stubborn souls who had been forged in the fire of a hard country, holding on to each other as the snow on the roof glittered in the morning sun, and their hearts, which had been warm for a very long time, finally, felt like they were home. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to help even more, please hit the hype button to help this story reach more listeners just like you.